Hello, this is John Wolf, and I'd like to welcome you back to the Wind of the Soul podcast. This is episode number 4, and it's titled The Law of Attraction and Intentionally Creating Our Reality. In this first segment, I'm going to discuss how I came to the understanding and the awareness that our thoughts are responsible for creating our reality. And a little later in the program, I will be discussing why this information is valid, why I feel it's legitimate, and why it's worthwhile for implementing in your life. The first time I became consciously aware of the idea and the concepts that my thoughts are responsible for my entire life experience was about 3 or 4 years ago. Now, I did have things that occurred to me during my childhood and during my entire adult life that also pointed to that fact. However, I didn't actually see something in black and white about this information until about probably 2003. And that information came to me in the form of the Seth material. And I spoke about Seth in a previous podcast. Seth material is channeled information. This information came through a lady by the name of Jane Roberts, and her husband Robert Butts transcribed all of the sessions. These were primarily private sessions, especially in the early years, just between the two of them. And they went on to publish several volumes of work, several books about the Seth material. Now, channeling, and I did speak about this in my last podcast, but to channel is to bring forth the awareness of non-physical consciousness. It is the consciousness that basically is flowing through our bodies. Again, we have the ability to do that when we are in the most highest tuned vibrational state of being, bringing in the joy, the excitement, the passion in our lives. Channeling doesn't necessarily mean relinquishing your physical vehicle and letting it become possessed in terms of your awareness is gone from it. It means the very source energy that flows through all of us being at the highest state of being that allows that to come through us. Everyone serves as a channel when they are at the peak of creation, when they are, whether they're a musician, whether they're an artist, whether they're an accountant, whether they're an actor, whether they're an athlete, whether they're a composer, whether they're a writer, an author. Whatever you do when you're focusing on your passion and your love and your joy, and you are tuned into that ability, you allow that information to flow freely through you. In some of us, it shows up in our creative products, the byproducts that we bring forth from the activities that we're engaged in that elicit our passion and our joy. In other people, such as Jane Roberts, it comes forth through information, it comes forth through words, it comes forth through inspirational advice. I'd now like to read a quote from Seth that provides an example of the type of information that Jane was receiving. You create your reality according to your beliefs and expectations. Therefore, you should examine these carefully. If you do not like some aspect of your world, then examine your own expectations. If you are in poor health, you can remedy it. If your personal relationships are unsatisfactory, you can change them for the better. If you are in poverty, you can find yourself surrounded by abundance. In the next segment, I want to dive into just how all of these things come into play. I mean, it's all well and good to talk about our thoughts creating our reality and how we are affecting that constantly, but how can we take control of that? How can we use this information and actually apply it? Is it pie in the sky, or is it something that can actually take form in our life and take shape? And also, is there scientific backing for this information? Is there a basis in science for this? Prior to discussing if there's scientific verification and validation of this information, I would like to talk about if there's any difference in the terminology that I'm using, if there's a difference between the law of attraction, the intentional creation of our reality, the deliberate creation of our reality. For my money, it's all one and the same. In my mind, I look at that as all being exactly the same thing. I believe that whatever someone feels comfortable and confident in calling this law, this tenet, this idea, this philosophy, it doesn't matter. Use whatever works for you, whatever works in how you address it. However, there's enough information showing that whatever you want to call it, we are the deliberate intentional creators of our reality. And I want to reference a few experiments that took place And bear with me on this, I'm not going to get too technical here, but I think it's important to take a look at how this information, this mystical, philosophical information that's been around for centuries, is now being verified by science. So I think it's important to look at this information, and like I said, without getting too technical, but because it is so valid in showing us that, okay, is this just something that is woo-woo, or does it really have a validity? Now, there was an excellent book that came out through Hay House in the last year, and I have that here with me. It was put out by Gregg Braden. He's the author, and it's called The Divine Matrix. Now, in this book, Gregg is speaking on the law of attraction, on the deliberate creation of our reality. He doesn't necessarily call it by those terms either, but he's talking about how consciousness is responsible for everything in this universe, how consciousness is responsible for not only the creation of this universe, but the perpetuation of it, the continued expansion and existence of life. And to verify and validate that, he talks about 3 different experiments. The first experiment took place around 1995, involving 2 Russian scientists whose names I'm not going to try to pronounce because I will probably butcher them too badly. They wanted to test the behavior of DNA on light particles, or photons, which is a quantum material our entire physical world is made from. Now, these scientists set up an experiment where they removed the air from a special tube, creating a vacuum which left behind the photons. And they used precise equipment that could measure the location of the particles, these light particles within the tube. The equipment detected that the photons were distributed throughout the tube in an unordered manner, which was pretty much what they were expecting going into the experiment. Up next, they placed human DNA inside the closed tube with the randomly ordered photons. Now, when measuring the photons with their equipment, they discovered that the particles had arranged themselves differently, simply due to the inclusion of the living human DNA. After removing the DNA, the scientists fully expected to find that the light particles had once again rearranged themselves in an unordered pattern, but instead they found the photons retained their state that was brought on by the human material despite its removal. This first experiment not only shows the effects consciousness contained within the cells of the DNA had on the particles which make up reality, but it also showed a connection that continues to hold up even after the removal of the human material. And as Braden states in his book, beyond wishful thinking and New Age isms, the experiment validated that we have a direct effect on the world around us. The impact of this experiment is very real. Experiment number 2 shows how our emotions and thoughts have a direct influence upon the cells in our bodies and their functionality. In the 1990s, these experiments were conducted by doctors and scientists working with the U.S. Army to determine whether or not the power of our emotions continues to have an effect on living cells, specifically DNA, once those cells have been removed from the body. In 1993, an experiment was conducted to test if we continue to have a direct effect on our cells after removal from the body, and if so, how far away in terms of distance will this effect continue? The researchers collected a swab of tissue and DNA from the inside of a volunteer's mouth. They took the sample and isolated it within another room in the same building. In a specially designed chamber, the DNA was measured electrically to see if it responded to the emotions of its donor, who was sitting in a room several hundred feet away. In his room, the donor was shown many different video images which were designed to elicit these genuine states of emotion inside his body. The images ranged from graphic wartime footage to comedy to erotic images and on and on. While this was occurring, his DNA was being measured for its response. At the precise time the donor experienced emotional peaks and dips, his cells and DNA showed very powerful electric responses, despite the fact that his cells were located in a room still several hundred feet away from his physical body. The testing continued beyond the division of a couple of doors and a few hundred feet. In the next portion of the experiment, the distances between the donor and his cells continued to increase, and at one point they reached a distance of 350 miles. The time between the donor's reactions and the responses of his cells was gauged using an atomic clock located in Colorado to guarantee the preciseness. And each time, even at the distance of 350 miles, the interval measured between the donor's emotions and his cell's response was 0. The effect was simultaneous. Now, the best explanation for why this was occurring comes from the ideas of interconnectivity among all things located within this quantum field of consciousness that is making up the stuff that we see in our physical universe. Distance at this level of being makes no difference. Once we realize we are all sharing this one form of consciousness, which is a connection to all things and within all things. Now, a colleague of Dr. Cleve Baxter's, and Dr. Baxter was the man who designed these experiments. His colleague's name was Jeffrey Thompson, and he summarized the findings in these experiments by saying